It was a cold Tuesday morning when the call came in. A naval officer, Commander James Richardson, had been found dead in his apartment in Arlington. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a body on the bedroom floor and a whole lot of questions that nobody had answers to yet. The kind of questions that would consume weeks of investigation. The kind of questions that would lead investigators down paths they never expected to travel. The kind of questions that would ultimately expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. Gibbs was the first one to know, the first one to get the call, and the first one to realize that this case was going to be different. This case was going to be dangerous in ways that he had learned to recognize over his decades of investigative work. This was the kind of case that didn't start simply and didn't end simply. This was the kind of case where every answer led to 10 new questions. This was the kind of case that changed everything. The alarm on his phone had gone off at 5 in the morning like it did every morning. Gibbs didn't believe in sleeping past dawn. He'd been in the military too long to develop those kinds of habits. 30 years of military service had etched itself into his bones. His body woke up before dawn whether he wanted it to or not. His mind was alert and ready before his eyes even opened. Sleep was something you did because your body needed it, not because you enjoyed it. Sleep was a necessity, not a luxury. 6 o'clock came and went. He was already at the coffee shop 2 blocks from his house, sitting at the counter with a black coffee and yesterday's newspaper. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly the way he liked it. No cream, no sugar, just coffee, the way it should be. The newspaper was full of the usual lies and half-truths that the media fed to the public. Political scandals, corporate malfeasance, wars in distant countries, all of it filtered through the lens of whoever controlled the story. Gibbs had learned a long time ago not to trust the news. He trusted facts. He trusted evidence. He trusted the work. That was all that mattered in this world. Facts didn't lie. Evidence didn't have an agenda. The work was sacred. The work was the only thing you could truly rely on. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. Body found. NCIS. Gibbs didn't respond. He didn't need to respond. He simply closed out of the message, left a $5 bill on the counter for his coffee, and walked out into the morning air. The morning air was cold, carrying the threat of winter. In a few weeks, snow would probably fall on this city. The holidays would come. People would spend time with their families. Gibbs would spend time at work, solving murders, finding truth, pursuing justice. That was his life. That had always been his life, and he wouldn't change it for anything. His car was parked outside, a vintage sedan that had seen better days but still ran like a dream. He liked cars like that. Cars with character. Cars with history. Cars that had been around long enough to know what they were doing. The kind of car that didn't need constant maintenance and constant upgrades. The kind of car that just worked because it was built to work. Built to last. Built to endure. The way things used to be built before everything became disposable. He drove to the address without using GPS. Gibbs had a memory for places. A memory for routes. A memory for the way the city laid itself out like a map in his mind. He'd worked in this city for 15 years. He knew its streets better than he knew the layout of his own house. He didn't need technology to tell him where to go. He just needed to know where to look, and Gibbs always knew where to look. That was what made him good at what he did. That was what made him the best investigator the NCIS had ever seen. The apartment building was in a quiet residential area, the kind of place where people lived quiet lives and minded their own business, where nobody asked questions about their neighbors or what they were doing behind closed doors. The kind of place where a murder could happen and half the building wouldn't even notice until the police showed up with their flashing lights and their questions. Gibbs had learned that most people didn't notice much of anything. Most people were too busy with their own lives, their own problems, their own concerns to pay attention to what was happening around them. And that's what murderers counted on. They counted on the fact that people didn't pay attention. They counted on the fact that nobody would see them. Nobody would remember them. Nobody would have any reason to suspect them. 3 police cars were already there when Gibbs arrived. A forensics van was parked on the street. Officers were putting up the yellow tape, cordoning off the area. A detective was standing by the door, clipboard in hand, looking tired and frustrated. He was probably thinking about how this case was going to complicate his life, how it was going to consume his next several weeks. He didn't know yet that he was about to hand off the entire investigation to NCIS. He didn't know yet that this case was going to be a lot more complicated than he could possibly imagine. He thought this was just another murder in just another apartment in just another part of the city. He had no idea what was actually happening here. No idea that this death was connected to something much larger, something much darker, something that reached into the highest levels of government and the most powerful institutions in the country. Gibbs flashed his badge at the officer guarding the door. The officer nodded and stepped aside without saying a word. That was the thing about being Gibbs. People moved out of your way. People understood that when you showed up, you were in charge. It wasn't something he did on purpose. It was just something that happened. It was the way he carried himself, the way he looked at people, the way he moved through the world like he knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was going to do when he got there. It was a presence, an authority, something that came from 40 years of military service and 15 years of leading one of the most effective investigative teams the government had ever assembled. Gibbs didn't have to announce himself. His presence did that for him. The apartment was on the 4th floor. The elevator was out of order, so Gibbs took the stairs. 4 flights up. His knees protested slightly as he climbed. Age was catching up with him, though he tried not to think about that too much. Retirement seemed like a punishment to him. The idea of sitting at home, doing nothing, working on that boat that never seemed to get finished, seemed worse than death. The work was what kept him alive. The work was what gave his life meaning. Without the work, what was he? Just an old man getting older. Just another person waiting for the end. But as long as there was work to do, as long as there were victims who needed justice, as long as there were truths that needed to be uncovered, Gibbs would keep doing what he did best. By the time he reached the top, he'd already started putting the pieces together in his mind. A naval officer, dead in his apartment. No forced entry. That meant the victim knew his killer, or the killer was someone who could get close to him. Someone he trusted. Someone he didn't think was a threat. The most dangerous enemies were always the ones you didn't see coming. The ones you let into your life because you thought they were on your side. That was how you got killed. That was how good people ended up on examination tables with tags on their toes and no answers for their families. The apartment door was open. A medical examiner was standing inside, studying the body. A forensics team was already taking photographs, collecting evidence, cataloging everything they found. The smell hit Gibbs as soon as he walked through the door. The smell of death. It was something you never got used to, no matter how many times you encountered it. It was a smell that reminded you that life was fragile, that it could be taken away at any moment, that the person who had lived in this apartment, who had eaten meals here and slept and probably dreamed about the future, was now nothing more than a collection of data points and physical evidence. A mystery to be solved, a case to be closed. Commander James Richardson was lying on his bed, fully clothed. He was pale, almost gray in color. His eyes were closed. His hands were folded across his chest in a way that seemed almost peaceful, almost like he was just sleeping. But Gibbs knew better. Gibbs had seen too many bodies to mistake death for sleep. Death left its mark. Death changed a person. Death took away the things that made them human and left behind just an empty shell. Just a body. Just evidence. The medical examiner looked up. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen. She'd been working with the NCIS team for 3 years now. She was good at her job. Thorough. Methodical. She didn't make assumptions. She followed the evidence wherever it led. She was one of the few people in the world that Gibbs actually trusted. Not many people made that cut, but she had. Over time, through hundreds of examinations and hundreds of cases, she had proven herself to be someone Gibbs could rely on. Gibbs, she said, nodding at him. We've got an interesting one here. They're always interesting, Gibbs replied. What killed him? That's the thing, Dr. Chen said. At first glance, it looks like natural causes. No signs of trauma, no injuries, no defensive wounds, nothing that would suggest foul play. But something about this doesn't add up. Something about the way he died. Something about the way his body is positioned. Something about the subtle signs that only someone with 30 years of experience would recognize. Like what? Gibbs asked, already moving closer to the body. His eyes were taking in every detail, every mark, every wound. Every piece of evidence that might lead them to whoever had done this. Every piece of the puzzle that would eventually fit together to create the complete picture of what had happened in this room. Like the way his lips are slightly discolored, Dr. Chen explained. And the way his skin has this unusual pallor. And the fact that there's a small puncture mark on his neck that someone tried very hard to conceal with makeup. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide that mark. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Gibbs leaned down and looked at the mark. It was barely visible. Just a tiny red spot, almost like a mosquito bite. But Dr. Chen was right. Someone had definitely gone to a lot of trouble to hide it. Someone had wanted this death to look natural. Someone had wanted it to look like Richardson had just died in his sleep. Heart attack, maybe. Stroke, maybe. Something that wouldn't trigger an investigation. Something that would just look like another death in a city full of deaths. Poison, Gibbs said. It wasn't a question. He'd investigated hundreds of murders. He'd seen poison used dozens of times. He recognized the signs. He recognized the work. Very likely, Dr. Chen confirmed. I'm going to run a full toxicology screen, but based on the symptoms and the delivery method, I'd say we're looking at something specialized. Something that someone went to a lot of trouble to deliver and then conceal. This is professional work. This is someone who knows what they're doing. Gibbs stood up and looked around the apartment. The bedroom was neat and orderly. No signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No broken glass or scattered papers. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant Richardson hadn't seen it coming. Richardson hadn't fought back. Richardson had probably been asleep when it happened, or at least not expecting what was about to occur. This was an execution. This was planned. This was personal. How long has he been dead? Gibbs asked. Between 24 and 36 hours, Dr. Chen said. I'll have a more precise estimate once I get him back to the lab. The lividity pattern suggests he was in this position when he died. He probably went to bed, fell asleep, and never woke up. Gibbs moved to the bedroom window. From here, you could see the parking lot below and the street beyond. Traffic moving in both directions. People going about their lives, completely oblivious to what had happened in this room, completely unaware of the death that had occurred just a few stories below them. People who would walk past this building every day for the rest of their lives and never know that a murder had been committed here. Never know that someone had died in this apartment. Never know about the investigation that would unfold as a result. The living room was just as neat as the bedroom. A sofa, a television, a bookcase full of military history and technical manuals about weapons systems and defense technologies. The kind of books that a naval intelligence officer would read. The kind of books that suggested Richardson was serious about his work. Serious about understanding the systems and technologies that he was responsible for monitoring and investigating. The kitchen was clean. The refrigerator had the usual things. Milk, vegetables, some leftover Chinese food from the previous day. Everything pointed to a man who lived a quiet, orderly life. A man who didn't have enemies. A man who didn't seem like the type to get murdered. But then again, the type who gets murdered is usually just like everyone else. Just normal. Just living their life. Just minding their own business. Until the moment when someone decides that they need to be dead. Gibbs was interrupted by his phone buzzing. A text from Magee. We're on our way. What do we have? Gibbs sent back a single word. Everything. Magee would understand. Magee had been with Gibbs long enough to know what that meant. It meant the case was big. It meant the case was complicated. It meant this was going to be one of those investigations that would consume all of them for weeks, maybe months. It meant they were stepping into something that went beyond a simple murder. It meant they were stepping into something that had power behind it. Something that had protection. Something that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. By the time Magee and Torres arrived at the apartment, it was nearly noon. The crime scene had been fully processed. Every surface had been photographed and analyzed. Every piece of evidence had been bagged and tagged. The body had been removed for the autopsy. The apartment was now just an empty space where a death had occurred. Just a shell. Just a place where someone had been murdered and where an investigation had begun. Magee was already on his laptop, pulling up the victim's records. Torres was going through the apartment, looking for anything that might give them a lead. And Gibbs was standing by the window, looking out at the city, thinking about motive and opportunity and the kinds of secrets that were worth killing for. He'd learned a long time ago that murder was almost always about one of three things. Sex, or power. Sometimes it was about revenge. Sometimes it was about pride. But usually, when you got down to it, it was one of those three. Commander James Richardson, Magee said, reading from his screen. Naval Intelligence Officer. 23 years of service. No disciplinary actions. No complaints. Clean record. No financial problems. No obvious enemies. By all accounts, he was a good officer who did his job well and didn't make waves. But someone still wanted him dead badly enough to commit murder. Then why is he dead? Gibbs asked, the question directed more at himself than at Magee. There's something else, Torres said, holding up a tablet. I found his personal computer in the home office. It's password protected, but the files that I can access show that he was working on something. Research into a company called Meridian Systems. He had files. He had notes. He had documentation. Lots of it. Gibbs turned away from the window. The name meant nothing to him, but that was okay. The name would mean something soon enough. Names always did. Everything always meant something when you knew how to read the signs. When you understood how to follow the evidence. When you understood that everything was connected. Everything told a story. Everything pointed to something larger. Meridian Systems, Gibbs repeated. What kind of company? Defense contractor, Torres said, scrolling through the information on his tablet. Government contracts. Billions of dollars in revenue. They develop advanced technology for military applications. Surveillance systems. Communication networks. Artificial intelligence. The whole package. They are big. They are powerful. They have connections everywhere. Gibbs nodded slowly. A defense contractor. Which meant government money. Which meant classified projects. Which meant that if someone was investigating them, they might have stumbled onto something that was worth protecting. Something that was worth dying for. Something that was worth killing for. And Richardson was investigating them? Gibbs asked. It looks like it, Torres confirmed. His files are full of notes about the company, questions about their financial arrangements, questions about where some of their money was coming from, questions about some of their projects. It looks like he was doing a deep dive into their operations, like he was trying to understand something, like he had figured something out that scared him. Magee looked up from his laptop. Gibbs, there's something else. Richardson's search history shows that he was looking into something called Project Fallout. It's classified. I can't access the files, but based on the metadata and the timestamps, Richardson was trying to get his hands on whatever documentation exists about this project, and he was looking at it intensively for the last 6 months. 6 months of obsessive research. 6 months of digging. 6 months of trying to understand something that someone clearly wanted him to stop investigating. Gibbs moved closer to Magee, looking at the laptop screen. The information was sparse, but there was enough there to paint a picture. A picture of a man who had stumbled onto something. A picture of a man who was trying to understand what he had found. A picture of a man who might have gotten too close to something that someone else wanted to keep hidden. A picture of a man who had probably made enemies. Powerful enemies. People who had the resources to make sure he never told anyone what he discovered. We need to know what Project Fallout is, Gibbs said. And we need to know what connection it has to Meridian Systems. And we need to know what connection it has to the people who wanted Richardson dead. This is the thread we need to pull. This is where the answer is. This is what's going to lead us to the truth. I can start making calls, Magee said. Pull some strings with my contacts in naval intelligence. See what I can find out. I have people who owe me favors. People who might be willing to talk about classified projects if I approach them the right way. Do it, Gibbs said. Torres, I want everything on Meridian Systems. Who runs it? Who works there? Where their money comes from? Who they do business with? Deed. I want to know everything about this company. I want to know every connection, every financial transaction, every employee, everything. Leave no stone unturned. Follow every lead. Find out what this company is really doing. Torres nodded and started making calls on his phone, working his contacts, pulling his strings, starting the process of unraveling the mystery that was beginning to take shape. Magee was already typing rapidly, sending emails, pulling up databases, following the digital trail that Richardson had left behind. And Gibbs was standing in the middle of the apartment, in the middle of the death, in the middle of the mystery, already thinking about the next step. Already thinking about where the investigation would lead. Already thinking about the fact that somewhere out there, someone was probably already planning the next move. Someone was probably already covering their tracks. Someone was probably already making sure that nobody else could discover what Richardson had discovered. They needed to move fast. They needed to find answers before whoever had killed Richardson decided that they had loose ends that needed to be tied up. Before whoever had decided that this investigation needed to be shut down decided to shut it down permanently. Before anyone else ended up dead. The drive back to headquarters took 20 minutes. Gibbs used the time to call Ducky. Ducky answered on the second ring, his voice warm and welcoming as always, as if the morning hadn't started with a dead body and a mystery that was only getting deeper. Ducky had that gift, that ability to remain cheerful and positive no matter what horrors he encountered in the morgue, no matter how many bodies he examined, no matter how many ways he saw human beings destroyed by human cruelty. Ah, Gibbs, Ducky said. I was wondering when you'd be giving me a ring. I heard we had a naval officer who had decided to take an unscheduled departure from this mortal coil. Richardson, Gibbs said. Commander James Richardson, Navy Intelligence. Poison. Delivery method looks like a specialized system designed to avoid leaving obvious evidence. Professional work. Poisoned, you say? Ducky replied. Well, that's certainly an interesting way to go about things. Most people who want to commit murder tend to go for the more obvious methods. 1. Knives. Things that are loud and immediate, violent and brutal and direct. But poison. Poison requires planning. Poison requires knowledge. Poison requires someone who understands chemistry and biology and the ways that toxins interact with the human body. Someone who understands medicine. Someone who understands science. Someone who knows exactly how much is needed to kill someone without causing obvious damage. Which means we're looking for someone with expertise, Gibbs said. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had training. Someone who had resources. Indeed, Ducky agreed. And someone who had a reason to believe that they could get away with it. Someone who thought they could deliver poison in such a way that it would look like natural causes. Someone who underestimated the medical examiners of this world. By the time Gibbs got back to headquarters, Magee had already started piecing together information. Project Fallout was classified at the highest levels. It was a joint project between the Department of Defense and several private contractors, including Meridian Systems. The project was officially designated as a research initiative into advanced artificial intelligence systems for military applications. But the unofficial information, the information that existed in the gaps between the official documents, suggested something far more ambitious. Something that went beyond just research. Something that involved actual operational systems. Something that involved real military applications. Something that involved weapons. It's a black budget program, G explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed restricted databases using his clearance and his contacts. Most of it is classified, but I found some references in declassified documents from earlier initiatives. Project Fallout appears to be an effort to develop autonomous weapon systems. Systems that can make tactical decisions without human intervention. Systems that can target and engage enemies without waiting for a command from a human operator. Technology that could change the balance of power across the entire world. Technology that governments and corporations would be willing to kill for. Autonomous weapons, Gibbs repeated. Robot soldiers. In simplified terms, yes, G said, but it's more sophisticated than that. These systems are supposed to incorporate advanced AI that can assess situations, evaluate threats, and make real-time decisions about rules of engagement. It's theoretical warfare technology, the kind of thing that the military dreams about but doesn't talk about publicly because it raises too many ethical questions. The kind of thing that could change warfare forever. The kind of thing that could make human soldiers obsolete. The kind of thing worth billions of dollars. The kind of thing worth killing for. Torres was looking through financial records on his own screen. His expression was becoming more and more concerned as he dug deeper into the numbers. And here's where it gets really interesting. Meridian Systems has been receiving government contracts for Project Fallout research. Billions of dollars in contracts. But when I trace the money, not all of it is going to the official corporate accounts. Some of it is disappearing into shell companies. Some of it is ending up in offshore accounts. Some of it is going to places that don't officially exist on any corporate ledger. Someone is stealing. Someone is diverting funds. Someone is taking government money and using it for purposes that the government doesn't know about. Someone's stealing from the government, Gibbs said. It wasn't a question. He'd worked with enough corruption in his time to recognize the signs, the patterns, the way money moved through the system when people were trying to hide it. More than that, Torres continued. Someone is diverting the money. Someone is taking the research. Someone is taking the work that was done on Project Fallout and they're doing something else with it. Something that's not part of the official program. Something that someone is willing to kill to keep hidden. Billions of dollars diverted. Classified technology stolen. Lives at stake. Gibbs stood in the middle of the bullpen, surrounded by screens and keyboards and the digital evidence of corruption and theft and murder. His mind was already racing ahead, connecting the dots, seeing a pattern that was starting to emerge. A pattern that was becoming clearer with every piece of information they uncover. A pattern that led to murder. A pattern that led to conspiracy. A pattern that led somewhere very high up in the chain of command. Richardson had found out about the theft. Richardson had started investigating. Richardson had gotten close to the truth. And someone had decided that Richardson knew too much. Someone had decided that Richardson was a liability. Someone had decided that Richardson needed to be removed from the equation. Permanently. Finally. Completely. But the question was who? Who had the power to order a murder? Who had the access to classified information about Project Fallout? Who had the connections to both the military and private contractors? Who stood to gain from keeping the theft hidden? Who was important enough to make a death happen without questions being asked? Who was powerful enough to make sure that the investigation went in the directions they wanted it to go? We need to talk to the people at Meridian Systems, Gibbs said. We need to find out who knew about Richardson's investigation. We need to find out who had the most to lose if the truth came out. This is where the answers are. This is where we'll find the person who gave the order. This is where we'll find the killer. The drive to Meridian Systems took 30 minutes. The corporate headquarters was in Arlington, a sleek glass and steel building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that money could buy good taste. The building was modern and impersonal. It had the kind of architecture that made you feel like you were inside a machine instead of a place where human beings worked. It was all sharp angles and cold surfaces, all glass and steel and carefully controlled climate. The kind of place designed to impress people but not make them comfortable. The security at the front desk was thorough. They had to check in, provide identification, and wait for an escort before they were allowed to proceed. Everything was professional and courteous and carefully calculated to make visitors feel like they were valuable, but also like they were being watched, like they were outsiders, like they didn't belong in this world. The executive vice president of operations, a man named David Harmon, met them in a conference room on the 20th floor. He was in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Gibbs made in a month. He had the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been trained in how to smile by people who understood that sincerity was less important than appearance, the kind of smile that hid what was really going on underneath. "Gentlemen," Harmon said, shaking their hands. His grip was firm but not too firm. "Professional," controlled. "I have to say, I'm a bit surprised to see the NCIS here. Is there some problem with one of our contracts? Is there an issue with our compliance with government regulations?" "We're here about Commander James Richardson," Gibbs said, watching Harmon's face carefully. There was a flash of something. Recognition, concern, fear maybe, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Harmon's control reasserted itself. His expression went neutral. His walls went back up. He'd recovered quickly. He'd recognized the name. He'd understood the implications. And he was not happy about it. "Richardson," Harmon said, his expression neutral now. "I'm not sure I know who that is. We have so many contacts in the government. Is he someone from our contracts department?" But his voice wavered slightly. His control wasn't quite as perfect as he wanted it to be. "He's someone who is investigating your company," Gibbs said. "He's someone who is looking into your finances. He's someone who is asking questions about Project Fallout. He's someone who is getting very close to understanding what you've been doing here." Harmon's face went very still. The careful neutrality fell away, replaced by something darker, something more dangerous. For just a moment, Gibbs could see the real Harmon underneath the suit and the smile. And what he saw was someone who was capable of making decisions that involved death. Someone who understood that sometimes people needed to be eliminated. Someone who didn't see murder as a moral issue, but as a practical solution to a practical problem. "I think," Harmon said carefully, "that we should stop having this conversation without legal representation present. I think that we should acknowledge that you're asking questions that go into classified territory, and I think that we should arrange a meeting with our legal team before we proceed any further." A classic deflection, classic legal maneuvering, classic strategy for someone who had something to hide. Gibbs stood up. He didn't look away from Harmon. He didn't blink. He just stared at the man across the table and let him see exactly what Gibbs was thinking. Let him see that Gibbs wasn't impressed by the suit or the title or the money or any of it. Let him see that Gibbs was a predator. That Gibbs was someone who had spent his entire life hunting down people like Harmon. People who thought they were above the law. People who thought their power protected them. Commander Richardson was found dead in his apartment this morning. Poisoned. Someone went to a lot of trouble to kill him. Someone who had the expertise and the resources and the connections to make it happen. Someone who knew that Richardson was getting close to something important. And we're going to find out who that someone is. We're going to follow every lead. We're going to ask every question. And we're going to make sure that whoever is responsible for Richardson's death faces justice. "I had nothing to do with that," Harmon said. But his voice had changed. The careful control was slipping. The anger was showing through. The facade was cracking. He was scared. He was very scared. "I didn't say you did," Gibbs replied. "I just said that Richardson was dead. I just said that he was investigating your company. And I just said that we're going to find out exactly what he was investigating and exactly who wanted him dead." Gibbs turned and walked out of the conference room. Torres followed. Magee gathered up his laptop and followed as well. Behind them, David Harmon sat at the conference table, his hand reaching for his phone, probably already making calls to lawyers and fixers and people who could help clean up the mess that was about to become very public. By the time they got back to the NCIS headquarters, Ducky had completed the preliminary autopsy. The toxin was definitely ricin, refined, weaponized, delivered through a specialized system that inserted the toxin through the skin in a way that would deliver a lethal dose without leaving obvious signs of injection. It was professional work. Very professional work. "This is professional work," Ducky explained as Gibbs, Magee, and Torres looked at the body on the examination table. "Whoever prepared this toxin and whoever delivered it knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't something that an amateur could have accomplished. This required knowledge. This required training. This required someone who understood both chemistry and human physiology. Someone who knew how to avoid leaving evidence. Someone who knew how to make a death look natural." "How many people could do something like this?" Gibbs asked. "In the continental United States?" Ducky said. "Maybe a few hundred. Military personnel with chemical and biological weapons training. Intelligence officers with black ops experience. Private security contractors who specialize in wet work. Scientists who work in the fields of toxicology and pharmacology." But the number of people who would have both the knowledge and the access to conduct this particular operation, that narrows it down considerably. We're looking for someone very specific, someone very skilled, someone very connected. "To how many?" Magee asked. "To people who work in or have connections to organizations like Meridian Systems," Ducky said. to people who have classified security clearances, to people who have a stake in keeping something hidden, to people who are willing to kill to protect their secrets. Over the next several days, the investigation deepened. McGee dug deeper into the financial records, tracing money through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Each transaction led to another transaction. Each company led to another company. The web was vast and complex and carefully constructed to hide the real flow of money. Torres interviewed employees at Meridian Systems, trying to find someone who would talk, someone who would explain what was really happening in the company, someone who was scared enough or disgusted enough to come forward. And Gibbs was everywhere, coordinating the investigation, following leads, asking questions that made people uncomfortable, asking questions that made people nervous, asking questions that made people understand that he was serious and that he wasn't going to stop until he found answers. What emerged was a picture of systematic theft and corruption. Project Fallout had been designed as a government initiative to develop advanced autonomous weapon systems. But over the years, the project had been diverted. The research had been stolen. The technology had been diverted to private use. And somewhere in the process, billions of dollars in government funding had disappeared. Not just disappeared, stolen, diverted, moved through a network of shell companies and private accounts until it had become virtually impossible to track. Someone in a position of power had orchestrated this. Someone with connections. Someone with access. Someone who understood how the system worked. Someone inside the government who had decided to use their position for personal profit. Richardson had discovered the theft. Richardson had started documenting it. Richardson had started putting together a case that would expose the entire scheme. And someone had decided that Richardson was a problem. Someone had decided that Richardson needed to be permanently silenced. Someone had decided to order his murder. By who? Who had the power to order a murder? Who had the access to both classified information and the resources to conduct an operation like this? Who stood to lose the most from having the truth come out? The answer would change everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior analyst at Meridian Systems named Sarah Chen. She came to the NCIS headquarters voluntarily, asking for protection, asking for someone to listen to what she had discovered, asking for the government to help her before the people she was about to betray decided to make her disappear like they'd made Richardson disappear. She was young, maybe 28 years old, and she looked terrified. She looked like someone who had finally reached the point where staying quiet seemed more dangerous than telling the truth. Sarah sat in the interrogation room across from Gibbs. She was young, maybe 28 years old, intelligent, but also clearly terrified. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were red from crying. She looked like someone who had been carrying a terrible burden for far too long and who had finally decided that telling the truth was worth the risk. She looked like someone who understood that what she was about to do might get her killed. But she was doing it anyway. Because conscience demanded it. Because morality demanded it. Because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to stop this. I need to tell you about Project Fallout, Sarah said. I need to tell you about what Meridian Systems is really doing. I need to tell you about what they've been doing with the government's money and the government's research. Everything. I need to tell you everything. We're listening, Gibbs said. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He just sat back and let Sarah tell her story in her own time. He understood that people who came forward like this needed to be handled carefully. They needed to feel safe. They needed to feel like someone was on their side. They needed to feel like their words mattered, like their sacrifice meant something. Meridian Systems was contracted by the Department of Defense to research and develop autonomous weapon systems, Sarah explained. Advanced AI technology, systems that could eventually replace human soldiers, systems that could make decisions about targeting and engagement, systems that represented the future of warfare. But about 5 years ago, something changed. Someone high up in the company decided that there was more money to be made if they diverted the research. Someone decided that they could take what they had learned and sell it to the highest bidder. Sell it to who? Gibbs asked. To everyone, Sarah said. To foreign governments. To private military contractors. To terrorist organizations. To anyone who had the money and the motivation to buy advanced autonomous weapons technology. They've been conducting a shadow operation for years, taking the government's research, taking the government's money, and converting it into private profit. Billions of dollars stolen and diverted and sold. And Richardson found out about this, Gibbs said. Yes, Sarah confirmed. Richardson was investigating financial irregularities. He was looking at where the money was going. He was piecing together what was happening. And when he got too close, when he started asking the right questions and putting pressure on the wrong people, someone decided that he had to be eliminated. Someone decided that he was a threat. Someone decided that he needed to be dead. Who? Gibbs asked. Who made that decision? Who gave the order? Sarah took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking even more now. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It was someone inside the government, she said. someone high up, someone with access to classified information, someone with the power to make things happen without going through normal channels, someone who was using their position to protect the theft and to ensure that no one could stop what was happening, someone who had everything to lose if the truth came out. Do you know who? Gibbs pressed. I have a name, Sarah said. I have documentation. I have emails. I have financial records. But if I tell you this, if I give you this information, I'm signing my own death warrant. The people I'm about to expose have already killed once. They won't hesitate to kill again. And I know that. I understand that. But I can't stay silent anymore. Gibbs stood up. He walked to the door of the interrogation room and gave specific instructions to Maji. Sarah Chen was to be placed in protective custody immediately. Federal protection. Round-the-clock security. Nothing was to happen to her. No exceptions. Gibbs was going to make sure that this young woman who had the courage to come forward was going to survive long enough to testify. Gibbs was going to make sure that her sacrifice meant something, that her act of courage resulted in justice. When Gibbs returned to the interrogation room, he sat back down across from Sarah and he said the only thing that mattered in that moment. Tell me the name. Sarah pulled a folder from her bag. Inside was documentation, emails, financial records, a complete picture of the conspiracy, and at the center of it all, a name that Gibbs recognized. A name that made sense when he thought about who would have the access and the power and the motivation to make something like this happen. Admiral Thomas Vance, the Director of Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The man who was supposed to be overseeing this investigation. The man who was supposed to be helping Gibbs find Richardson's killer. The man who was, in fact, Richardson's killer. Or at least, the man who had given the order. Gibbs sat back in his chair. He took a moment to let the implications of what Sarah had just told him settle into his mind. An Admiral, a man who had spent 40 years in the military, a man who had risen to the highest levels of power, a man who had betrayed everything that the military stood for in order to accumulate wealth and power and influence, a man who had ordered the murder of one of his own subordinates to keep his crimes hidden. How sure are you? Gibbs asked. I'm certain, Sarah said. I've seen the emails. I've tracked the money. Vance is the link between Meridian Systems and the government. He's been directing the diversion of resources. He's been protecting the operation from oversight. And when Richardson threatened to expose everything, Vance made the decision to have him eliminated. It wasn't a difficult decision for someone like Vance. He'd made difficult decisions before. He'd ordered strikes that killed civilians. He'd approved operations that violated international law. Ordering the murder of one naval officer was easy for someone like that. And you have proof of all this? Gibbs asked. I have documentation, Sarah said, but it's not complete. There's still a lot that's classified. There's still a lot that I don't have access to. But what I have is enough to prove that Vance was involved in the diversion of Project Fallout resources. Whether I have enough to prove that he ordered Richardson's death, I'm not sure, but I know that he did. I know that he made that decision. I know that he gave the order. Gibbs left Sarah in the interrogation room with 2 federal agents standing guard outside. He walked back to the bullpen where Maji and Torres were working on analysis and collating evidence. One look at Gibbs' face told them both that something had changed. Something had shifted in the investigation. Something major. We need to be very careful from this point forward, Gibbs said. We need to assume that everything we're doing is being monitored. We need to assume that everything we've discovered is already known to the people we're investigating. And we need to assume that the person at the top of this conspiracy is someone we know. Gibbs told them about Admiral Vance. He told them about the email chain that Sarah had provided. He told them about the financial records that proved that Vance had been receiving payments from Meridian Systems through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. He told them everything that Sarah had told him. Maji's face went pale as he listened. Torres began to pace back and forth, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Both men understood what this meant. This wasn't just a criminal investigation anymore. This was something far more serious. This was an investigation that reached into the highest levels of government. This was an investigation that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the military. This was an investigation that could change everything. We need to move carefully, Gibbs said. We need to make sure that we have everything locked down. We need to make sure that we have all the evidence documented and backed up. We need to make sure that nothing disappears and nothing gets lost. Because once we make this move, once we accuse an admiral of murder and corruption, there's no going back. Once we go public with this, we're committing to a path that might destroy him, or it might destroy us. Over the next 48 hours, Maji and Torres worked to document everything. Every email was printed and filed. Every financial record was analyzed and cross-referenced. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and secured. They built a case that was airtight, a case that no defense lawyer could undermine, a case that proved beyond any doubt that Admiral Thomas Vance had been involved in the diversion of Project Fallout resources and that he had ordered the murder of Commander James Richardson to cover up that involvement. But before they could take action, before they could bring charges against an admiral, they needed to brief someone higher up in the chain of command. They needed to brief someone who had the authority to make decisions about how to proceed against such a high-ranking official. They needed to move carefully, very carefully. Gibbs made the call to the director of the FBI. He explained the situation. He explained what they had discovered. He explained that they had an admiral who was implicated in both corruption and murder. The director listened without interrupting. It took 10 minutes for Gibbs to lay out all the evidence. When Gibbs was done, there was a long moment of silence on the other end of the line. "This is going to be complicated," the director finally said. "An admiral is not a small thing. This is going to require coordination with the Pentagon. This is going to require coordination with the military justice system. This is going to require very careful handling." But Gibbs could hear the determination in the director's voice. This was going to happen. They were going to go after Vance, no matter the cost. "Then we need to handle it right now," Gibbs said. "Before Vance figures out that we know. Before Vance decides to have us all eliminated like he eliminated Richardson. Before Vance decides to bury the evidence and shut down the investigation." The director agreed. A task force was assembled. Representatives from the FBI, representatives from the military justice system, representatives from the Pentagon, all of them sworn to secrecy, all of them committed to seeing this investigation through to the end, no matter where it led or how high up the chain of command it went. Sarah Chen was moved to a secure location. Federal protection, military protection, everything that could be done to keep her safe was being done, because Sarah was the key witness. Sarah was the person who could connect Admiral Vance to the conspiracy. Sarah was the person whose testimony could bring down one of the most powerful men in the military. Sarah's life was now in danger, very serious danger, but Sarah was also in extreme danger, because Admiral Vance knew that she existed. Admiral Vance knew that she had access to classified information about the conspiracy, and Admiral Vance would do whatever it took to make sure that Sarah never made it to trial, that Sarah never had the chance to testify against him, that Sarah joined Richardson as another loose end that needed to be tied up, another body that needed to be disposed of. The safe house was a converted federal building in a remote location in the Virginia countryside. Barbed wire fences surrounded the perimeter. Federal agents stood guard in rotating shifts. There was no way in and no way out without authorization. There was no way to breach the security without being detected. Sarah should have been safe, but safety is a relative thing. Safety is something that's always temporary. Safety is something that can be taken away at any moment if the people who are determined to take it away are willing to use enough force. Gibbs received the call at 2 in the morning. Federal agents had discovered evidence that someone had been trying to breach the security at the safe house. Sophisticated attempts, professional attempts, attempts that suggested resources and expertise that went beyond what a typical criminal organization would have access to. Attempts that suggested military involvement. Attempts that suggested that Admiral Vance was running out of patience. That Admiral Vance was deciding that waiting for the legal system to take its course was no longer an option. That Admiral Vance was deciding to take matters into his own hands. Gibbs and the tactical team moved Sarah to a different location. A location that had been kept completely secret. A location that only Gibbs and the director of the FBI knew about. They moved her in the middle of the night. They took a circuitous route. They used every counter-surveillance technique that the military and the FBI had developed over decades of experience. By dawn, Sarah was somewhere completely new. Somewhere she was supposed to be safe. For a while, it worked. Sarah was safe. The investigation continued. The case against Admiral Vance was being built piece by piece, document by document, evidence by evidence. But then something changed. Something happened that nobody had anticipated. Something that shifted the entire investigation in a completely different direction. Gibbs was in his office when he got the call from the Pentagon. Admiral Vance wanted to meet. Admiral Vance wanted to discuss the investigation. Admiral Vance wanted to come to an arrangement. Admiral Vance wanted to negotiate. The Admiral had decided that talking to Gibbs was better than having the investigation continue without his input. "This is a trap," Torres said immediately when Gibbs told him about the call. "Of course it's a trap," Gibbs said, "but we're going to take the meeting anyway. Because if Vance is willing to meet, it means he's scared. It means he thinks he can control the situation. It means he doesn't know that we have all the evidence locked up and secure and impossible to destroy." The meeting was scheduled for noon at a secure location in Washington, D.C. A government building. A building full of security. A building where Admiral Vance would be exposed if he tried anything overtly hostile. Or so they thought. But exposure isn't always a deterrent. Some people are willing to accept exposure as long as they achieve their goal. Some people are willing to destroy everything if it means protecting themselves. Some people are willing to burn it all down rather than admit defeat. Admiral Vance was one of those people. Gibbs could see it in the man's face as soon as they sat down across from each other in the secure conference room. Vance had made his decisions. Vance had set his course. And now Vance was willing to do whatever it took to stop the investigation. Stop it. Suppress it. Destroy it. Any way he could. You've got a good case, Vance said without preamble. I'll give you that. The documentation is solid. The financial records are clean. The timeline is clear. You've done good work, Agent Gibbs. But you've also made some mistakes. Serious mistakes. Mistakes that are going to have consequences. Such as, Gibbs asked, such as putting your trust in a witness who's not as reliable as you think, Vance said. Sarah Chen is a confused young woman who has made some poor decisions. Sarah Chen is someone who's been manipulated by outside influences into making false accusations against me. Sarah Chen is someone whose testimony would never hold up in court. I have a team of lawyers who can tear her apart on the stand. We have more than Sarah's testimony, Gibbs said. We have financial records. We have emails. We have transaction histories. We have proof. You have circumstantial evidence, Vance corrected. You have things that look damning when you put them together in a certain way. But a good lawyer could create reasonable doubt. A good lawyer could argue that the financial records are open to interpretation. A good lawyer could argue that the emails could have been forged. A good lawyer could create enough confusion to make your case fall apart. Maybe, Gibbs said. But we're not interested in maybe. We're interested in the truth. The truth, Vance said, and there was something almost sad in his voice, as if he understood exactly what was about to happen but was trying to accept it anyway. Do you know what the truth is, Agent Gibbs? The truth is that Project Fallout was going to be a disaster. The truth is that the military was about to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a weapon system that didn't work. The truth is that I found a way to make that project produce actual results. Real, practical results that could be used to protect American interests around the world. The truth is that I diverted some resources from a doomed project into initiatives that actually matter. I saved lives, Agent Gibbs. Everything I did to save lives. The truth, Gibbs said, is that you murdered a man who found out about your theft. The truth is that you're willing to murder again to keep your secrets safe. The truth is that you're a criminal. And the truth is that you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for what you've done. Vance smiled. It was a terrible smile. A smile that didn't contain any warmth or humanity. A smile that contained only darkness and the understanding that he was out of options. The understanding that his game was up. The understanding that he had been caught and that there was no way out. Except maybe one. I think you'll find, Vance said, that things are about to become far more complicated than you imagine. Before Gibbs could respond, alarms began to sound throughout the building. Red lights flashing. Sirens wailing. The sound of chaos and confusion sprang through the corridors like wildfire. Vance stood up. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to fight. He just stood there with that terrible smile on his face as federal agents rushed into the conference room, weapons drawn, ready for combat. There's been an incident, one of the agents said breathlessly. Sarah Chen. She's been taken. Someone breached the safe house. Someone got inside. They took her. Gibbs stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward and clattered against the wall. His face went cold and hard. The pieces were falling into place now. The pieces of Vance's plan. The pieces of Vance's backup plan. The pieces of everything that Vance had been working toward all along. Vance had known that Sarah was the key. Vance had known that without Sarah's testimony, the case against him would be much weaker. And Vance had used his meeting with Gibbs as a distraction, as a way to keep Gibbs occupied while his people extracted Sarah from the safe house. It was a bold move, a desperate move, a move that showed just how much Vance was willing to risk to stay free. Where? Gibbs demanded. We're still getting information, the agent said, but it looks like she was taken to a location in Northern Virginia. We are mobilizing tactical teams now. We are moving to intercept. Gibbs didn't wait for the full briefing. He walked out of the secure conference room, down the corridors, and out into the parking lot where his car was waiting. Magee and Torres were already moving. They were already heading to the location where Sarah had been taken. They were already preparing for what would probably be a gunfight. What would probably be a confrontation. What would probably end with someone dying. But they had to get to Sarah. They had to make sure she survived this. They had to make sure that her sacrifice meant something. The location turned out to be an abandoned military facility in Northern Virginia, an old research center that had been shut down years ago and left to decay. The kind of place that the government forgot about. The kind of place that was perfect for conducting an operation that you didn't want anyone to know about. The kind of place where bodies could disappear and nobody would ever find them. the kind of place where someone could take a hostage and hold them without fear of discovery. Gibbs and the tactical teams surrounded the facility. They cut the power. They sealed the exits. They had helicopters in the air with spotlights that turned night into day. They had sniper teams in position with eyes on every window and every door. They had made the decision that this was going to end. That Vance's reign was over. That justice was going to be served, one way or another. And then they waited. Because sometimes the best move is to let the situation develop. Let the people inside understand that they are trapped. Let them understand that surrender is their only option. Let them understand that there's no way out. Let them understand that the game is over. But Admiral Vance didn't surrender. Instead, he did something that nobody had anticipated. He sent out a message. A video message recorded on his phone. A message that went out through encrypted channels to media outlets. A message that exposed the entire conspiracy. Every detail. Every financial transaction. Every email. Every piece of evidence that the military and the government had been trying to keep secret. Vance had decided that if he was going down, he wasn't going down alone. He was going to bring everything down with him. He was going to expose every secret. He was going to reveal every crime. He was going to burn it all to the ground. The strategy of a man with nothing left to lose. The strategy of a man who had decided that destruction was better than surrender. By the time the tactical teams breached the facility, it was too late. Vance had already found a way to turn his defeat into something larger. By exposing the conspiracy, by admitting to the theft and the murder, Vance had made it impossible for the government to cover any of this up. The story was already spreading. The truth was already public. The conspiracy was already unraveling. The system was already breaking down. Sarah Chen was found in the back room of the facility, tied to a chair but alive. Relatively unharmed. Frightened but breathing. Gibbs cut the restraints and helped her to her feet. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wide with fear. But she was alive. She had survived. She had lived through something that could have killed her. And her survival meant that she could still testify. She could still speak the truth in court. Behind them, federal agents were moving through the building, clearing rooms, securing evidence, documenting everything. They were moving carefully. They were moving professionally. They understood that this was a major crime scene and that every detail needed to be preserved. Every piece of evidence needed to be collected. Every statement needed to be recorded. This was going to be one of the biggest prosecutions in recent memory. Admiral Vance was found in the main conference room, sitting at a table with a computer in front of him. He'd sent his final message just before the tactical teams entered the building. A message to his lawyer. A message to his family. A message to the media. Thousands of messages that exposed everything. All the details of the conspiracy. All the evidence of the crime. All the secrets that he had been trying to keep hidden. All the lies that had been protected for so long. And then he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. He decided that capture and trial and imprisonment were things he was unwilling to accept. He decided that one final act of control was better than allowing the system to control his fate. He decided that death was preferable to facing justice. And so he'd chosen death. The body was processed by forensics. The building was secured. The evidence was collected. And the investigation that had started with Commander Richardson's body on a bed in Arlington came to an end in an abandoned military facility in Northern Virginia. The news broke on every channel. The story spread across the world. A military conspiracy. A murdered officer. An admiral involved in theft and corruption and murder. The government issued statements. The Pentagon issued denials followed by confirmations. The details spilled out in a way that nobody could stop or suppress. The truth was out. The lies were exposed. The system was forced to acknowledge what had happened. Gibbs was in the bullpen at NCIS headquarters when a new director of NCIS arrived. Admiral Vance's position had been left vacant. The military needed someone to take control. Someone to rebuild trust. Someone to clean up the mess that Vance had left behind. Someone who could restore faith in the institution. "I want to thank you," the new director said, looking directly at Gibbs, "for your work on this investigation. I know it wasn't easy. I know it went into territory that was uncomfortable for everyone involved. But you did the right thing. You followed the evidence. You found the truth. And you didn't let anyone or anything stop you from getting there. That's what we do," Gibbs said simply. "We find the truth. We follow the evidence. We make sure that the people who are guilty face justice. That's our job. That's what we're here for." The director nodded and walked away. Magee and Torres approached Gibbs' desk. Torres had a slight smile on his face. Magee looked tired but satisfied. They had done it. They had solved the case. They had brought a murderer to justice. They had exposed a conspiracy. They had saved a witness. They had done their job. "What happens now?" Torres asked. "Now we close the case," Gibbs said. "We finish the paperwork. We make sure that all the evidence is properly documented and filed. And then we move on to the next case." "And Sarah?" Magee asked. "Sarah goes into witness protection," Gibbs said. She gets a new life, a new identity. She gets a chance to start over somewhere where nobody knows about Project Fallout or the conspiracy or any of it. She gets to just be a person who works a job and lives a quiet life. She's earned that. She's earned the right to peace. She's earned the right to safety. She's earned the right to a future. She's pretty lucky, Torres said. She could have ended up like Richardson. She did end up like Richardson, Gibbs said. Just in a different way. She learned that doing the right thing has costs. She learned that standing up against corruption and murder means putting yourself in danger. She learned that there are people in this world who are willing to kill to protect their secrets. But she also learned that there are people like us. People who won't give up. People who won't be intimidated. People who will follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how high up the chain of command it goes. Over the next several weeks, the aftermath of the investigation played out in the media and in the courts. The evidence against Admiral Vance was entered into the record. The conspiracy was documented. The theft was quantified at over $3 billion. The names of everyone involved were released. The cover-ups were exposed. The corruption was laid bare for everyone to see. Some people faced charges. Some people made deals with the prosecution. Some people disappeared quietly, their involvement minimized or completely erased from the official record. That's how these things always worked. Some people were sacrificed. Some people were protected. The system preserved itself by making sacrifices when necessary. But one thing was clear. The truth had been exposed. The lie had been uncovered. The conspiracy had been dismantled. And the man who had ordered the murder of Commander James Richardson had faced the only justice that he was willing to accept. A bullet to the head administered by his own hand rather than face the consequences of what he had done. Gibbs stood in the bullpen late one evening, long after everyone else had gone home. The NCIS headquarters was quiet and empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The computers sat dark on the desks. This was the time when Gibbs did some of his best thinking. This was the time when he could process what had happened and what it meant. The case of the Fallout conspiracy was closed. The investigation had been concluded. Justice had been served, though not in the traditional way. The guilty party had taken his own life rather than face trial. The accomplices had been prosecuted or had made deals. The system had been cleaned of corruption, at least for a while, at least for now. But Gibbs knew something that most people didn't understand. He knew that the cleanup was temporary. He knew that corruption would return. He knew that there would be other conspiracies and other murders and other cases that pushed the boundaries of what was legal and what was ethical. This was the way the world worked. This was the way humans worked. People were capable of great good, but they were also capable of great evil. And sometimes evil won. Sometimes corruption flourished. Sometimes murderers escaped. But not on Gibbs' watch. Not if he could help it. Because that was the nature of the work. That was the nature of investigation. You uncovered truth and you exposed lies and you pursued justice. And then you did it all again. Because there was always another case. There was always another mystery. There was always another truth waiting to be discovered. There was always another victim who needed justice. There was always another murderer who needed to be caught. That was what kept Gibbs going. That was what made him show up every morning before dawn and work late into the night. Because somewhere out there was someone who had done something wrong. Somewhere out there was a victim who needed justice. Somewhere out there was evidence waiting to be found and truth waiting to be revealed. And as long as that was true, Gibbs would be here, working, investigating, following the evidence, pursuing the truth, no matter where it led, pursuing it through halls of power, pursuing it through corporate corridors, pursuing it down into the darkest depths of human corruption. Because that's what he did. That's what he had always done. That's what he would always do. The lights in the bullpen went out. The building went dark. And NCIS headquarters stood quiet and empty under the night sky, waiting for morning to come and waiting for the next case to arrive. Waiting for the next victim. Waiting for the next investigation. Waiting for the next opportunity to find the truth and serve justice. But that's another story. That's another investigation. That's another case that would require following the evidence, uncovering the truth, and pursuing justice through the complicated systems of law and order that we have built to protect ourselves from each other. For now, the case of Project Fallout was closed. The investigation was complete. The truth had been exposed, and the people who had been involved had faced the consequences of their actions. It wasn't a perfect ending. Nothing in this line of work ever was. But it was justice. It was true. It was the best that could be achieved in a complicated world where not everyone followed the rules and not everyone did the right thing. And for Gibbs, that was enough. That would always be enough. Because the alternative was to give up. The alternative was to stop searching for truth. The alternative was to allow the guilty to escape and the innocent to suffer and the lies to go unchallenged. And Gibbs had never been willing to accept that alternative. Not in the past. Not now. Not ever. So he would come back tomorrow morning. He would sit at his desk. He would wait for the phone to ring and the next case to come in. And he would do what he had always done. He would find the truth. He would pursue justice. He would make sure that nobody got away with murder on his watch. That was what it meant to be Gibbs. That was what it meant to be NCIS. And it was enough.